So nice to see everyone in conversation and enjoying the afternoon and enjoying each other. It's a delight. My name is Megan Sweeney. I am a professor of sociology and an associate director here at CCPR. I'm standing in for our wonderful director, Martha Bailey, who is off globetrotting and is sorry that she could not be here with us today. So today's seminar is jointly sponsored between CCPR and Department of Sociology. And a warm welcome to all our prospective sociology students who are joining us today. We're delighted to have you here. Our speaker today is one of our own, Professor Ann Owens. Ann is a faculty member in the Department of Sociology and a affiliate here at CCPR. Her research focuses on the causes and consequences of social inequality with an emphasis on neighborhoods, housing, education, and geographic and social mobility. Ann has many accolades, and I won't waste our time going through too much of it, but just a few. She is a past recipient of the William T. Grant Foundation Scholar Award. She is the recipient of the 2022 William Julius Wilson Early Career Award from the ASA section on inequality, poverty, and mobility. She had a residential fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And she's editor of the journal City and Community, which is the journal of the American Sociological Association's Community and Urban Sociology section. So Ann has told me that clarification questions are fine during the talk. So if anything's unclear, feel free to ask. If there's anything for more in-depth discussion, we'll save it to the end. And we will be ending pretty promptly right at 1:15 today, because I know a bunch of people in the room have other obligations starting then. And for sociology perspective, students in the room, those of you with interest in demography, strong or uncertain of any level, please feel free to join us immediately following this talk. We're going to do a flash session with a few grad students and a few faculty members with interest in demography just across the hall in 4355, our small conference room. And you can just follow me. I'll be going there after the seminar. So with no further ado, let me turn the floor over to Ann Owens, the changing relationship between school and residential segregation. Thanks, Ann.
Great. Well, thank you, Megan and McKenna and the staff that always do such a wonderful job setting up the room for us. I'm really delighted today to be sharing what is very much work in progress. So I'm going to share some empirical findings. We're still kind of working on the story and the directions we want to head next. So I look forward to hearing what you think is interesting or questions you have to clarify what I'm going to tell you today. Okay, so why should we care about segregation? So when we talk about segregation, we're thinking about the distribution of people across neighborhoods or schools or occupations or other social or physical spaces by race or income or gender or some meaningful characteristics. So why do we care how people are distributed? It's not just about the distribution or the separation. It's really about the fact that by virtue of distribution, unequal distribution by these meaningful social characteristics, inequality emerges. And so there's a large body of literature showing that residential and school segregation lead to unequal opportunity and unequal outcomes. So if we look at the literature on the mandatory school desegregation in the 1960s and 1970s, there's strong evidence that school integration improved Black, Mexican-American, and other non-white children's educational, occupational, income, and health outcomes, sometimes even into the next generation. If we look in the contemporary period, I forgot to say to start, sorry, this is joint work with Sean Reardon at Stanford. It was there in writing, sorry about that. But I was going to reference Sean. He and his team recently showed that even today in our contemporary period, the magnitude and growth of academic achievement gaps is higher in more segregated places. And then in the prominent work on neighborhood effects by Raj Chetty and colleagues, they find that one of the key predictors of what hinders upward economic mobility is local racial and economic segregation. So reducing segregation, therefore, is a lever for improving equity. And to reduce segregation, we have to understand its dynamics. It's helpful to know if residential and school segregation kind of hang together when you're thinking about designing policy strategies. If school segregation doesn't follow trends in residential segregation, if you enact an integration promoting housing policy, it's not going to move the needle on school segregation, which might not be your goal, but it's sort of important to know what the trickle down effect or unintended consequences might be. And it's also important to update our theories around the causes of segregation to reflect how these two contexts do or don't operate jointly. So in this paper, we set out to explore the joint dynamics of neighborhood and school segregation. So I think the conventional view of this relationship is sort of unidirectional, that where a child lives either sort of determines or strongly influences where they go to school, either because of residentially based student enrollment policies where neighborhoods are assigned to a particular local school, or there's at least an influence there. Families don't want to travel super far to send their kids to school. We've come in our work to conceptualize neighborhood and school segregation as having more of a bidirectional or cyclical relationship, right? So neighborhood segregation and neighborhood residential patterns certainly influence school segregation, but there is sort of an opposite direction as well, where school segregation influences neighborhood segregation. Schools are a public good that families consider when they're choosing where to live. If parents have preferences for schools of certain compositions or preferences for characteristics of schools that correlate with composition, school segregation can sort of feed back into residential choices and segregation patterns. So even though there's sort of been this assumed relationship between segregation and these two contexts, there's actually sort of surprisingly scant research actually quantifying how strong that relationship is and how it changes over time. So there's been some past work showing that these two levels of segregation in these two contexts were highly correlated sort of through the 2000s. And so we kind of update this literature and offer a different way to look at it than a correlation. Okay, so in addition to this bidirectional relationship, there's lots of factors that complicate this relationship. There's conditions that might kind of break this link between neighborhood and school choice or neighborhood choice and school enrollment and ultimately segregation. So first, there's a kind of a demographic explanation in that residential patterns may look different among children than among all people, which I've found in some of my past work. So overall levels of residential segregation include older people, childless families, people who aren't paying attention to schools. And so when we look at overall residential segregation, it might not map on to where children live and ultimately where they attend school. And then second, we have education policies. So historically, where you lived strongly influenced where you attended school, and that is changing over time. Or that has changed over time. So over the past few decades, the share of students attending their locally assigned public school, so that's the sort of dark green part of the bar, has declined a little bit. It's still high. So the most recent data we have available right now is from 2016, so it's out of date. But the far right bar there shows that about 69% of children attended their public assigned school. But public school choice, the sort of light green part of those bars, is growing, especially charter enrollment. In addition to charter schools and magnet schools, public school districts may also have student enrollment policies that permit choice among its schools. So like open enrollment, other sort of choice policies. There's other districts that allow enrollment in public schools across district lines, it's pretty rare. And public schools can also use either mandatory or voluntary integration programs based on race or SES. And so all of these things, so all of those public school options are different ways to assign children to schools or for children to choose to enroll in schools that often are not linked to neighborhoods. So many charter schools, for example, don't have any sort of residential catchment zone. Some do, most don't. And these other choice options kind of break that link between where you live and where you go to school. Private schools are also an option, and they could account for disparity in residential segregation and school segregation. The data I'm going to show you, we don't include private schools in our measures of school segregation, but I'll count for them in some later analyses. So generally, past research shows that white and higher income parents exercise choice to opt out of more diverse locally assigned schools. This could increase school segregation, and it could also lead to more diverse neighborhoods where you live no longer, this sort of link to the public good of the local school, that link is broken. And some of my past work has shown that parents are willing to live in slightly more integrated neighborhoods if they can send their kid not to the diverse neighborhood school. So we're going to sort of build on this line of work. These are some factors that might complicate the relationship between neighborhood and school segregation and cause them to decouple. So I'm going to show you some empirical findings for two sort of very basic descriptive research questions. First, how closely coupled are school and residential segregation in the US? How has this changed over time? And then second, getting into some of the factors I was just talking about, what are the demographic, geographic, and policy conditions that influence whether school and residential segregation are tightly coupled? Okay, so to do this, sorry, did you have a question? I'm new to reading glasses and I can't see a thing when I'm looking up. So I'm just like, I don't know what's happening out there. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
This qualifies as a clarification.
I'll tell you if it doesn't.
Very nice. If these choice programs and this opportunity for decoupling, is this something we should think about as happening in like only large urban areas? And if you're looking at the whole country, kind of like, how are you thinking about the different impacts that these, like the potential for decoupling in like different types of city settings versus small towns?
Yeah, great question. So the sample we're gonna focus on is the 100 largest metropolitan areas. Then I'm gonna zoom in on large districts. And you're right, a lot of this choice is sort of operating mainly in these large districts. And so it's something that we've started to look at if we look at sort of all districts or all counties or things like that, like where are the places that are sort of very choicey and not choicey. So yeah, a good thing to keep in mind. Yeah. Anyone else, as long as I can see you all? Yeah.
Just to clarify, there are two baths, right? One is school segregation and the other is neighborhood segregation. And you're saying they can be traded off with some policies. So maybe we allow school segregation, but at least we don't have neighborhood segregation. Is that one way to think about what you're doing?
Sure. I mean, I think ideally I want to buy both. I want to reduce segregation in both contexts, and that's where we're sort of headed in our research project. But I think as these policies have come into play that allow people to decouple that decision, the dynamics can be moving in opposite directions. So we now sort of need a combination of policies that addresses both. It's not just automatic that like schools is going to follow what's happening in neighborhoods. Yes.
So story that you have in mind here, one in which people have preferences over segregation, or one in which people have preferences over school quality and different means by school quality?
Can you say that in a slightly different way?
So if I don't know what your districts look like, so I don't have a good sense
Yeah.
of what the relative school performance is
Sure.
of segregated versus
Yeah.
schools. But do we think that people are sending their kids to private school because
Because they're worried about the quality or because they don't want
Yeah.
their kids to go to school with?
and if you have certain groups that are wealthier than others, they might have more of a means
Yeah.
to buy out of the system?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's both. I think people are trying to get their kids into the situation that is best for them. I think how they define best is absolutely defined by race and class. There's been different studies that show that even if you hold constant test scores, funding, everything you can think of, people still have race-based preferences. And many white parents in particular that they will avoid the sort of a Black avoidance story in a lot of this literature. And yes, other highly educated, higher income, and often white parents are sort of more able to exercise choice than other groups. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna keep going, but if I don't see you, holler, it's because I can't see. Aging is a gift. Okay. So what are our data? So to estimate school segregation, we need data on public school composition. So Sean and I and our research team spent several years developing the longitudinal imputed school data set, or LISD. And this took data collected by the US National Center for Education Statistics, Common Core of Data, a deep dive, very deep rabbit hole dive into those data, found lots of data errors, abnormalities, because it's just taking data reported by the schools and sort of publishing it. So lots of zeros that should be missing, et cetera, et cetera. So We developed an imputation model to impute and clean the data. The data include annual data from 1991 to 2023. In this set of findings, I'm just matching sort of decennial year data from the LISD to the census. And that leads to the neighborhood composition data. So in order to estimate segregation between neighborhoods, we need to know what neighborhoods look like. We use data from the census. We leave out 5-year. We could have, many of you know, of the American Community Survey, which is an annual demographic survey. We could have used 5-year aggregations. There's some challenges there because the sampling frame differs between the census and the ACS. We see it sort of induces changes in segregation where we don't think there are real changes. And we actually have a paper where we develop a method to account for this, but in this most recent round, it seems like things are a little bit wacky. So I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but we're just going to go with the 4 decennial censuses listed here. Okay, so we estimate racial ethnic segregation between non-Hispanic white students or residents, and then Black, Asian, or Hispanic students or residents. For the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the results for white-Black segregation. The other groups, each of these groups has different historical, legal, histories. I won't have time, but if I had time, I could show you the results for Asian and Hispanic. As I mentioned before, we're looking at the 100 largest metropolitan areas. And so we're estimating segregation at the metropolitan area level, and we include all of the schools and all of the public schools, I should say, sorry. So public schools, including magnet schools, charter schools, traditional publics. We don't have private school data for this estimation. We include all public schools and all neighborhoods in the metro area. Okay, so there's lots of different ways to measure segregation. Generally, we think about kind of 2 broad ways to do it. So we could measure exposure, which tells you about the composition of the school or neighborhood of the average person from a certain group. So for example, white-Black exposure would measure white students' exposure to Black students in their school or neighborhood. But this is sensitive to demographic change. So if there was an influx of a certain population, so for example, in the public school population in the US, there's been a huge influx in the Hispanic population over the past 60 years. And so everyone's exposure to Hispanic students has gone up because there's just more Hispanic children in the population. So it's helpful to get sort of a snapshot of what a particular neighborhood or school looks like, but it makes it difficult to compare across places or over time. And so instead, a better way to do that is to use one of the measures that's in what we call sort of the evenness class of segregation measures. And this is estimating how evenly, or rather unevenly, distributed 2 groups are across schools or neighborhoods, given that local population at a point in time. So it's accounting for demographic change over time and differences across place, right? So we would expect, exposure to Hispanic students to be much higher in Los Angeles than West Virginia, and this can sort of account for that. So we use something called normalized exposure, and basically it builds on exposure indices to measure the difference between 2 groups' exposure to one of the groups. So what does that mean? So basically, if we want to interpret Black students' exposure to white students, we also need to know about white students' exposure to white students, or just the general white population composition. That helps us understand if Black students have disproportionately high or low exposure. Like if you knew that the average Black student's school was 20% white, is that high or is that low? Like if the local population is 20% white, that just seems, to match what the population is. So that is essentially what normalized exposure is accounting for. It's sort of saying, okay, I'm going to sort of account for the overall population by comparing the exposure of 2 groups to one of the groups. Okay, so I'm just not going to belabor this, but the top, 2 equations are just the exposure index equations for, I don't know where if there's a thing, for, I'm going to knock over this creepy robot. Okay, exposure of group X, I don't think this works, exposure of group X to group Y, which is basically just sort of a weighted average of the Y share of the person's tract, neighborhood, or school. And then sort of the exposure of people in group Y to other people in group Y. So if you imagine X and Y are white and Black, sort of Black, white exposure, white exposure, something like that. And so the difference in those terms is our normalized exposure measure. So I think it's probably more helpful to illustrate it using some real data and also a little history lesson on the power of public policy. So this slide shows the distribution of students by race in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District in 1968. So the height of the bars tells you the number of students in school with that population composition indexed as school percent Black along the x-axis. The blue parts of the bars are white students, the red parts of the bars are Black students. And so what you can see is that many white students, this sort of tall blue bar, are attending schools that are essentially 0% Black. Many Black students, this red bar, are attending schools that are 100% Black. This is 14 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And so we can estimate exposure, which is essentially the average, exposure of a white student to a Black student or vice versa. So we can say, well, the average white student school is 10% Black and 90% white. The average Black student school is 76% Black, 24% white. And so the difference, so our segregation measure is just capturing the difference in that. So if we said, okay, white exposure is 0.9, Black-white exposure is 0.24, that's a difference of 0.66. If you did it the opposite way, 76 and 10, you get the same thing. So we're basically saying, what is the difference in white students and Black students' exposure to white students or Black students? It doesn't matter, it's a symmetrical measure. Here's the history lesson 3 years later. There is a Supreme Court decision telling Charlotte-Mecklenburg to get its act together and that it has to actually come up with a policy to integrate its schools. And the average white and average Black student ends up attending a really similar school in terms of racial composition. So both of those, the average student in each group is attending a school that's about 30% Black and 70% white. Segregation shrinks to 0.03. Spoiler alert, this is not a stable story, but this is conceptually what our measure is doing. I should also note normalized exposure only takes into account two groups. So it's sort of ignoring the presence of ignoring the presence of Hispanic or Asian or people of other races that aren't identified as white or Black. So it can sort of be interpreted as the difference in two groups' exposure to one of the groups in terms of the relative share of those groups. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we estimated segregation in the 100 largest metropolitan areas. But segregation can occur between schools or between neighborhoods within school district boundaries within metropolitan areas or between school districts in metropolitan areas. So for example, if we think about here in Los Angeles, if we think about the composition of LAUSD boundaries and also the LAUSD student body, that LAUSD boundary is like a bright line that shapes where people choose to live and where they send their children to school. And so the LAUSD catchment area, the sort of geographic area that the schools serve, is less white and more Hispanic than LA County or LA Metro as a whole, because there is residential and school sorting or segregation across school district boundaries into Culver City, Pasadena, Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, et cetera, et cetera. And so one nice feature of the normalized exposure index is that we can decompose it, we can break it down into its between and within school district components. These parts are additive. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to do a little bit of decomposition, and then I'm going to move from the metropolitan area level to the district level because there's some interesting things going on in large districts. But it is important to note that if we sort of think about the total level of segregation in a metropolitan area, most of that is happening between districts rather than within districts between schools or neighborhoods. So we have to link schools and neighborhoods to their school district in order to do this analysis. So for traditional public schools, sort of locally assigned ones, and for magnet schools, that's easy. They're just linked to the district that administers them, which is geographically defined like an LAUSD. Charter schools sometimes are operated, so like LAUSD operates some charter schools, but then lots of other charter schools are operated by like a KIP or just their own single entity. And so the way they show up in our administrative data is that they're their own district, but we link them to the geographic district in which they're located to sort of get a sense of that spatial inequality. And then we link neighborhoods to the school districts in which most of their population lives using one of the University of Minnesota demography centers, the geo-correspondence tool. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a couple different levels of segregation. So just to kind of summarize those here, we measure metropolitan area white-black segregation with the normalized exposure measure among students between schools, among residents between neighborhoods, and then among both students and residents between school districts. And then I'm going to jump down to talking about segregation at the school district level, because that's where a lot of these choice policies are operating. And so we're going to estimate segregation among students between schools and among residents between neighborhoods within districts. Yes.
So when you say white and black, you mean, is it non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, or just white?
Oh yeah, sorry, good question. I didn't say that. Yes. So for the most part, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black. There's a caveat to that we'll get to in a little bit. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so pause for a promotional interlude. So the Segregation Tracking Project is the data and research hub that Sean and I launched on the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board in May of 2024. I will mention that nearly all of the data I'm going to show you today is publicly available. Please don't scoop me, I'd be very cross, but we have the LISD data set that I mentioned is there. All of the neighborhood and school segregation data is there. We have a beautiful map. We have lots of data files. If you don't like normalized exposure and you prefer something else, I won't take it personally. We have 6 more measures for you. So not now because I'm talking, but in the future, you should visit our website and let me know if you have any questions. And if you email the tech support, it's just me. So let me know. We'd love for you to use our data. End of promo. Okay, so moving on to starting to get into some of the results. Okay, so question 1 was sort of how closely coupled are school and residential segregation in the United States, and how has this changed over time? Okay, so this figure shows the average level of segregation in the 100 largest metropolitan areas from 1990 to 2020. And so that blue solid line is showing you that school segregation has increased by about 20%. The blue line is for school segregation. The scale of the normalized exposure measure is between 0 and 1. And so this sort of 0.32 to 0.38 level indicates a 32 to 38 point difference in the proportion of Black students, for example, in the average Black and white student school. So that's quite large. The orange line is indexing residential segregation, and you can see that during this same time period, while school segregation was increasing by about 20%, residential segregation was declining by about 20%. And then what the black line, the black dashed line at the bottom is doing is really just indexing kind of the average difference. So kind of the difference between those lines. And the way that we're doing the difference is school minus residential segregation. And so you can see that in 1990, the difference was negative. Residential segregation was higher. That orange line was above the blue line. And then as residential segregation starts declining and school segregation starts increasing, that difference goes up. And so now the sort of difference in the two segregation measures is about 0.1. Yes.
Is that residential for all people or students?
All people, but you're previewing me nicely. Yes, so this is for all people. Yeah. Okay, so if you take away nothing else from this talk, you can go and tell your friends that, well, first of all, you can go to our website, but second of all, you can go and tell your friends that school segregation is still a problem and it is actually getting larger. So, concerning. Another way to look at how, so that's sort of a difference way to look at how they're coupled. Another way to look at how residential and school segregation correspond is to look at their correlations rather than their differences. And so these are scatter plots by year of school segregation on the y-axis and residential segregation on the x-axis for the 100 largest metropolitan areas. So each dot is a metro area. And so we can see that in 1990, in many metropolitan areas, there's dots below the 45-degree line, indicating that school segregation was lower than residential segregation, which is sort of what we saw, the sort of average blue line is below the orange line in 1990. And then we can see over time, the correlation gets stronger, things sort of tighten up. And by 2020, school segregation is higher than residential segregation above that 45-degree line in most places. And that's sort of consistent with those lines going in opposite direction. So what might this imply? What do we think is going on here? So we think that what we're seeing in 1990, and I'm going to test this empirically in a little bit, is that we're still seeing stronger remnants of court-ordered desegregation. So many districts went under mandatory desegregation orders, and many northern cities went under voluntary desegregation orders or desegregation plans in the 60s and 70s. Many of those were still in place in 1990 and then sort of started to expire in the 2000s, 2010s through today. And so what we see is that in 1990, perhaps there is still sort of a purposeful action to bring school segregation lower than residential segregation, and that's sort of declining over time as our commitment to integration has faded. So I'm going to focus on the difference, the sort of, looking at the trends over time and this black difference line rather than the correlation, but it's another way to think about the difference. Okay, and so then we wanted to start to explore, well, what accounts for the growing divergence and sort of the fact that these lines are moving in opposite directions. So as was suggested just a minute ago, I've shown you trends in residential segregation among all residents in a metropolitan area, but it may be the case that trends in residential segregation among school-age kids, so we have data on kids age, 5 to 17, are different than those among all residents. So the school-age population is more racially diverse than the whole population. Families with children may have different residential preferences than childless folks or people living alone, specifically if they're thinking about schools when choosing where to live. So in a metropolitan area with very strict residential assignment to schools, we'd expect neighborhood segregation among school-age kids to track really closely with segregation among actual school segregation. So we are going to look at that next, and picking up on the question here earlier, data note in 1990, so in the US Census, as many of you know, Hispanic ethnicity and race are historically two separate questions, which allows us to identify non-Hispanic people of various races. In 1990, in the published data, it's not broken out by Hispanic ethnicity and race and age. So for 1990, we have to just do white-black segregation among school-age kids. We've sort of looked at the correlation and the levels of these things in later years when we can do both. We don't think it's a huge problem, but it is something to note. Okay, so this is the same figure that you saw previously, tracking the average levels of white-black segregation between schools in blue, between neighborhoods in orange, and then that difference line. So again, we're sort of seeing these diverging trends here. So I'm going to add two lines to the figure. So first, the green dashed line tracks white-black segregation only among school-age kids, age 5 to 17 years old. So a few things to note about that line. So first, residential segregation among school-age children is higher than among all people. I've shown this in other work, especially powerful with regard to income segregation. Income segregation in the United States has only increased among families with kids. It has not increased overall. That's a different talk. And then it's also sort of, it's high, it's sort of, I can't do this. It's higher than school segregation until 2020, when school segregation eclipses it. And it's also flatter than residential segregation among all residents. So it's sort of declining less. And so these facts are reflected in the second line that's been added to the graph. The gray dashed line shows you the average difference, school minus residential segregation, only among school-age kids. And so again, kind of reflecting the sum of the lines above it, the gap is sort of more negative than for that black line, which is the difference between school and residential segregation among all people. So the gap is sort of more negative. It's bigger for school age kids. And then the gap starts to narrow towards zero, and then eventually becomes positive by 2020, again, reflecting that school segregation is higher than residential segregation among school age kids. So it could be the case that when I redo this paper in 20 years, this will sort of be some convergence moment and we'll sort of see them align very closely. It could be the case that residential patterns among school age kids sort of are following the general patterns, and we continue to see this divergence if school segregation also keeps rising. So I think we can't sort of conclude, oh, you know, these differences we see here are just sort of a demographic story. If we just look at school age kids, it's, you know, it's like a lot more consistent. I think we still have, you know, a puzzle to try to puzzle through. Okay, so I'm just going to focus on residential segregation among school age kids from here on out. So the full population stuff is we're not going to focus on that anymore. And we're going to start to think through some of these school policy or geographic explanations. So it may be the case that, you know, I talked about school districts and their importance in structuring people's choices, both of where to live and where to go to school. And so it could be the case that residential and school segregation correspond differently at different levels of geography. So most of the student enrollment policies that we were talking about either operate within districts, sort of from a policy perspective, the district is administering it, or even with something like charters, you know, often people are maybe looking for something nearby. It's sort of going to stay within their geographic district boundary, even if it's not required, not always, but generally sort of on that smaller scale than a whole metro. So differences in residential and school segregation within school districts more directly kind of implicate some of these public school choices. Between district differences in segregation could also imply the importance of private school enrollment. So private school students are not in our school segregation measures, but they are in the resident child population data. And so it's one way to try to suss this out. Okay, so this figure is focused kind of only on trying to break down that difference line into its between and within district component parts. So the middle gray dashed line is the same thing that you saw when I added it to the bottom of that previous figure. It's the difference between school minus residential segregation among school age kids over time. So again, we're sort of going from residential segregation being higher than school segregation in 1990, and then sort of these lines going in opposite directions until the difference line crosses zero, so that now school segregation is higher than residential. The top and the bottom lines break down the total difference into the between and within district components. So the top line is showing you the between district component. It is always positive and it changed little. So the positive value means that student segregation between districts was consistently higher than residential segregation of school age kids between districts. And so what this means is that the public school population looks more different across districts than the child resident population does. And so this is where we think private school could be an explanation here, because it's sort of accounting for that difference of who's in the population for each of these lines. So for example, if we imagine that it's consistent with past literature, if more white kids, for example, enroll in private schools, if their district is more diverse or less white, then the public school population is going to end up being less white than the overall residential child residential child population. So segregation of students between districts is going to be higher. They're going to look more different. So for example, like if we think about the city of Chicago, where I grew up, which is a big private school option. So if we think about the contrast in the Black composition of the public school population between like the Chicago public schools and its suburban districts, that is more stark than if you actually just look at the child population of those, of Chicago and its surrounding suburban districts, because many white parents in Chicago are opting out of the public school population altogether. So it's one hypothesis we have. I'm not going to directly test it today because I want to focus more on what's going on within districts. So the solid black line is showing you the trend in the within district component. And so this is basically a population weighted average of all the districts within a metropolitan area. And so this remains negative over time. So this suggests that within school districts, residential segregation is actually higher than school districts, but it's converging towards zero. And I'm going to focus on it because it's sort of the thing that is sort of most similar, the contrast isn't great here, is most similar to the overall line. And so we think it might be particularly important for understanding what's going on. Okay, so now I'm going to move from talking about metropolitan areas to talking about school districts. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the 500. So we started with our sample of 100 large metropolitan areas. Within those 100 largest CBSAs, we're looking at the 500 districts that enroll the most Black students. And we do this because small districts and racially homogeneous districts aren't contributing much to the segregation story. Like there's just not, they don't have a lot of weight in the overall measures, and often segregation is sort of not even applicable there because there is no diversity. One note is that there are 13,000 school districts in the United States. 2/3 of all Black students in the United States are in these 500. That's one indicator of how high segregation between districts is. So you can get 2/3 of the Black student population. It's something like maybe only a quarter of the white population if you just look at these 500 large districts. And of the population I've been talking about, the 100 largest CBAs, it's almost 90% of Black students. So we're focusing on these large districts because this is where segregation is relevant. This is where Black students are attending school. And so the figure on the right is sort of taking those trend lines that I've been showing you for a little while now, and it's showing you the average within districts rather than within metros. So here we see on the one hand a similar story. The blue line is still indexing school segregation. It is rising over time within these large districts. And similarly, we see that residential segregation, again, only among school-age kids. The green line is pretty flat. It declines a little bit, but it's pretty flat. So this is similar in terms of the trends that you saw before, but in contrast to our metropolitan area results, we see that residential segregation is higher than school segregation within districts. Okay. So we wanted to look at some of these student assignment policies to see if we can understand how they account for each of these things. So we start by looking at charter and magnet enrollment in a district. We have this on our LISD data set from the NCES base data. Charters first started in the early 90s. Magnets have existed since the 1960s. But their status wasn't recorded. Schools' charter or magnet status was not recorded nationally in our base data until 1998. So that's life. We don't have it before that. Based on past research, we hypothesized that higher charter, and the magnet story is a little more complicated, but to a lesser extent, magnet enrollment could lead to higher school segregation, and it could lead to lower residential segregation. I've shown this in some of my past work. When charter sector expands in a district, people are willing to live in more diverse neighborhoods if they can send their kid to a charter school instead of the local public school. So this would point to a larger difference between school and residential segregation. And I'll note that we'd love to be able to measure school choice more broadly and capture those things like interdistrict choice, open enrollment. There's just not good data longitudinally and nationally for all districts on these enrollment data. And so we're limited to charters and magnets. This is a great data project that many researchers have started and been thwarted by. So if you have good ideas on how to unleash the robots to get these data, let me know. The problem often is longitudinal. Like we just don't have the data from even the Wayback Machine does not have the data that we need. Okay, and then we also measure the share. So we know among students that live in a district, we can look at a private school enrollment. Sorry, we know what share of students I taught this morning, guys. I'm gonna run out of steam here soon. Okay, we know the share of students living in a district that are attending private schools. This comes from the National Center for Education Statistics EDGE data, which are sadly, I think, on the funding chopping block and will no longer be funded in the future, which is a real shame. Based on past research, we hypothesize that if parents often are opting out of public schools in places that are more diverse. In that case, segregation among public school students could actually be lower because the people most averse to diversity have gotten out. And so past research has shown that segregation among public school kids actually goes down a little bit. We're less clear in our hypotheses here. I think generally, if we see private school enrollment as a tool just to generally decouple where you live and where you go to school, you'd expect there to be a larger difference in residential and school segregation patterns. And then finally, we examine whether releases from mandatory desegregation court orders account for the difference we see. And so we're taking data from work by Owen Thompson. It was this really interesting paper looking at how desegregation affected the Black teacher labor force in the South. And so we draw on some of his data on the timing and existence of mandatory integration orders in school districts. And we look to see what happens if districts are released from those orders. So typically in the order, there was some benchmarks where districts had to meet some level of integration, and then the court would review it and say, okay, you can be released from this. And so past research has shown that when districts are released from these court orders, school segregation goes up and residential segregation actually goes up too, because now where you live matters more, and it's again determining where kids are going to school. So we might expect this to lead to convergence in these trends. So these are some of the things we're looking at. I think we're still kind of trying to think about how they all work in tandem, and we're not there yet. But I'll show you what we have done. So ultimately, I think our theory is causal in terms of trying to understand the policy, geographic, demographic conditions that cause or lead to residential and school segregation. We do not have a strong causal inference approach yet. So our hypotheses are drawing on past research that often does have stronger identification strategies for a given factor. So there's, just to be very clear, there's certainly concerns about reverse causality, many other things here. But as a first take, in 3 separate models, we're predicting school segregation, residential segregation among school-age kids, and their difference from a longitudinal regression model with district and year fixed effects. The main predictors are the student assignment policies I just described. We control for some basic demographics on both the school and residential side. We're clustering our standard errors at the district level. Okay, so this is just a very simple coefficient plot that shows results for predicting school segregation in blue, residential segregation in green, and the difference in black. So each of the panels include in order school, residential, and their difference. And so generally, and I should say this is from a model where all of these factors are in one model. We've run them one at a time and the results are very similar. Results are consistent generally with our prediction. Public school choice is associated with higher school segregation, lower residential segregation, and a larger difference between them. The private school and mandatory desegregation order dismissals are only borderline significant. And I think one thing we're thinking through is the challenge of interpreting positive coefficients for the difference, because on the one hand, it could indicate like a shrinking difference because the difference starts out negative. It could sort of imply this convergence, which might be what's going on in terms of the dismissal story. But on the other hand, we know that choice generally leads to higher school segregation. So if we sort of are trying to project out into the future, the school choice kind of positive coefficient, rather than meaning sort of divergence from a negative value, could lead to sort of growing divergence. So still thinking that through. Okay, I've thrown a lot at you, and so I want to just start to wrap up by giving you some of the empirical findings that we think are important as we start to piece together this story. So again, the first thing that I would like you to walk away knowing is that school segregation has increased in large metropolitan areas and large districts. I think there's been this narrative that it's either declining or it's flat or it's not a problem anymore. And I think we would counter that by saying that 72 years after Brown, we're not back to where we were in the Charlotte Mecklenburg picture I showed you in 1968, but our schools are increasingly racially segregated. The metro story is that residential segregation has declined, which is consistent with other scholars that have studied this, less so among children. And at the metro level, residential segregation is now lower than school segregation. The district story is the opposite. School segregation is lower than residential segregation, but it is sort of converging. And then we also are starting to look into the ways that student assignment policies are decoupling residential and school segregation patterns. Okay, so some of the implications here, I think we're trying to think through implications both for our theorizing around the causes of residential and school segregation and also policy implications. So, one top order piece of information is that residential and school segregation in metropolitan areas and large districts are moving in opposite directions. It's not clear if this, like I said, we're sort of at this convergence point and things are going to be coupled, or if we're going to continue to see this rise in school segregation that goes on to outpace residential. So I think both for theory and for practice, we can't just say, oh, well, residential segregation is the thing that leads to school segregation. They are still very highly correlated. They both still inform one another. But if if you're designing a set of policies and you assume that something like inclusionary zoning is going to have an impact on school segregation, not necessarily going to happen. Or if you think about drawing student assignment boundaries in ways that could lead to residential integration, there's sort of these school choice as kind of an out, as kind of a key decoupling force between these demographic patterns. So what we're doing on our research team is continuing to figure out how to interpret some of these findings, but we're also trying to assemble a large database with one of our postdocs, Faramala, about a wide range of housing and education policies to try to understand, is there some combination of policies or confluence of policies that seems to be particularly effective in reducing segregation in both neighborhoods and schools? So that's what we're working on now, but I'm going to stop there and welcome more questions and comments. Thanks. Yes, my friend Pavo.
I hate to start with such a hard question, but you know so much about this topic. I'm so curious to hear what you think. I mean, you mentioned why not both?
Mhm.
When Till brought up the question of which one.
Yeah.
How do we think about how much we care about these two different kinds of segregation? How do we think about how much we care about these two different kinds of segregation?
Yeah.
Long-term, short-term,
Mhm.
children are the future.
They are. That's what I hear. So so I think there have been this is an important question. So it's sort of trying to think about, like, should we care more about where kids live or where they go to school? And like my social scientist answer is we should care about both. I think my collaborator Peter Rich and I wrote an article a couple of years ago trying to articulate this idea that there's sort of a joint neighborhood and school structure, and looking at them separately actually doesn't really make sense. If you go through kind of the studies that have tried to articulate effects in both, you find kind of very mixed findings. I think there's slightly more evidence on the neighborhood side, but it's not like super conclusive. But I think what might be more helpful to think about it is if you're designing a policy that you think is going to invest in one of the contexts, you need to really carefully think through what's going to happen to the other. So for example, our housing mobility studies, like in Moving to Opportunity, for example, a lot of the families that used the Moving to Opportunity voucher to move to a low poverty neighborhood did not change schools. In contrast, there have been policies like Montgomery County where they have sort of they haven't moved people, but they've rezoned them to lower poverty schools and seen huge effects. And so I think just like thinking through, like rather than assuming, like even in, opportunity maps used in our affordable housing programs, for example, I think there's this assumption of like, oh, well, like schools are inextricably linked to neighborhoods. And so they're a key aspect of opportunity. And like, sometimes, but sometimes not, because if there's lots of choice and many local, if one of the things you're thinking about is like social capital among neighbors, and then all the neighbors don't send their kids to that school. So I think just, other parts of my research agenda more broadly are to try to make the point that housing and education policymakers need to be talking to one another at all, but also more than they are now. So that's a cop-out answer, but it's the best you're gonna get right now. Yeah.
So one of the things that's like when you're presenting this is sort of like, I think of like the school policies in Chicago, where they have these issue of declining enrollment.
Yeah.
But the teachers union has been very against shutting down.
Yep.
Local schools. And I was wondering if there's an interaction between sort of these like, not being able to shut down lower enrolled schools and an increase in school segregation.
Yeah, good question. So I'm trying to think if I know, people have certainly studied school closures, and I'm blanking on whether they've directly linked it to the sorts of segregation measures we use. We certainly know, there's a great book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, about the Chicago school closures, where those schools targeted for closure tend to be predominantly non-white, often predominantly Black. And it's a very politically contentious issue. San Francisco has been in a policy debate about it for several years now. Yeah, I'm not sure it's a good point. Yeah, so the idea would be if we, one potential avenue to school integration would be to reassign students in heavily depopulated schools in a careful way that might promote integration. Of course, that disrupts, the communities they may have at those schools. Yeah, I don't know that I've seen empirical evidence on that, but it's an interesting hypothesis. I mean, declining enrollment is something that like many schools districts are worried about. LAUSD is very worried about it. Not only from a demographic, people with children aren't able to afford to live here, so they leave perspective, but also losing public school population to the charter sector. So that's part of it as well. Yeah. Yes, Victor.
If you have a moment, or you need a moment for that, can you tell us how valid for Hispanics and?
Oh, okay. I have a whole second set of slides. 1 second. All right, so this is Hispanic. We see there's way less divergence. So this is true for Asian as well. So this is the metro story. So we see rising segregation both in the residential, bless you, and school contexts. We see a slight divergence, school segregation is rising faster, but they're moving in the same direction, which was the contrast to white Black. Same for white Asian. Here's the scatter plots. You don't sort of see that. Our hypothesis with white Black segregation was that there was sort of a cluster down here due to mandatory desegregation orders, those focused primarily on white Black segregation. So you don't see, because of the population at the time, so you don't see that same pattern here. One interesting thing that the white Asian scatter plots points out is that if you just look from 1990 to 2020, like many metropolitan areas just had really low levels of white Asian segregation, period. And then you start to see that spread. This is the families with children. I'm trying to think what other interesting takeaways I can give you in 90 seconds. But yeah, I guess I'll say that the story is different. The patterns among and segregation for white Asian and white Hispanic follow each other more closely. There is sort of faster, school segregation is rising faster. And so we haven't, we're still trying to kind of understand the factors. And so one thing we want to do is to try to understand if things like school choice are operating differently for these groups. And we're just getting into that now. Yes.
Great thought. I'm interested in kind of like your framing around, and you spoke about, thinking about possible causes for this. And a lot of the framing was one about like the different policies that could have caused, but also about like school choice from like a family perspective. And you mentioned like white families wanting to send their students from like less diverse neighborhoods. And I'm wondering if you consider some of the literature on like racialized risk of like Black families sending their students or their children to predominant white schools versus Black.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and I think this goes back to a question earlier and sort of thinking about like whose preferences have I been discussing. So yes, you're totally right in that I was mainly focused on the story of kind of white avoidance of certain groups, but I think we know throughout our policy history and our social science research that often when we're asking families or students to move, it's the minoritized groups that are asked to move and to sort of be the ones that change schools or change neighborhoods. And there's, great reason why families would not want their children to be the only or one of a few in a particular group. So that's part of it as well. I mean, generally, when you ask people about their ideal neighborhoods and schools, Black and Hispanic families are more likely to report wanting sort of they want a higher level of integration. They don't want to be the onlys, but they want to have a higher level of integration than white families do. And I think part of the charter story as well is a lot of charter schools purposely are trying to serve communities that have been historically underserved. And so they're opening, they're sort of saying, hey, these public schools and these neighborhoods are like not great. Students of color deserve better. We're going to open here, often have maybe a particular curriculum that, is culturally focused on a particular group. And so I think this is where I never want the work to be interpreted as us saying that, there's inherent value in integration and sitting next to someone of a different race. I think, I would like there to be great schools and great neighborhoods everywhere for everyone. I think historically we have not seen at a large scale that separate can be equal. We just have not done that yet. So if we could do that, and maybe the answer is moving resources rather than moving children, that's another approach. I just don't think we've sufficiently done that. So, but yeah, thank you for complexifying the conversation.
Yeah, I grew up in the Sacramento school district and we had some magnet schools, but far more common, I think, were magnet programs within schools.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of segregation within the school itself.
Yeah.
Based on the magnet program, which could maybe draw in students from across the district who were, high achieving. And there was a lot of disproportionate, resources available to people in that high achieving program versus the rest of the public school. And so I guess one clarifying question, the magnet measure that you have, that's just the school or also captures whether a school has a magnet program, and then also how do you think about within school segregation and that aspect of this narrative?
Yeah, great questions. So we are limited to identifying magnet schools as they're reported to the district. So it kind of depends how that district sees that entity, if they see it as a separate school or not. I think there is another variable of whether a school has a magnet program, but we don't at the national level. The civil rights data we do. We have not dug into who's enrolled in that. But so it's probably capturing more magnet schools than magnet, a school with a magnet program would not be counted as a magnet school unless they report kind of separate statistics for the two entities. Yes, within school segregation, we don't look at that here. So there's lots of ways to think about that. You could think about who gets access to magnet or IB or AP classes, and we know there's lots of racial disparity in that. Other scholars have looked at classroom level segregation and showing both kind of academic tracking, but also just even on the same track. There's definitely high levels of both economic and racial sorting within school. But yeah, our starting point here is sort of school level data. But yeah, another very important aspect of it. Yep.
Is the story look different in school segregation between what we call elementary schools and high schools? That might be some of the bringing it within the school?
Yeah, so one thing I think I feel to say is that when we're estimating school segregation, we do it at the grade level first, and then we sort of weight up to the aggregate. And exactly for this reason, often there's like, well, sometimes a district will have like one high school and there cannot be segregation at the high school level because there's just one. Generally, high schools are larger and more diverse, and so there is less segregation at the high school level. So we're accounting for that by doing this grade level measure, like methodologically, but we haven't looked into it substantively as much. Yeah. Yep.
I don't know if this is possible, but if you did this measures of segregation by income level, what would you say?
Yeah. So I've probably run all this by income and I'm gonna forget what we found, but neighborhood income segregation among families with children has risen since 1990 in large metropolitan areas. And so has school segregation, although the school segregation data is limited to students' qualification for free or reduced price lunch, which is sort of a course measure. It's kind of just like a poverty measure. And those data are also wacky for a lot of reasons. And so that was one of the main goals of the imputation model that we developed, was to improve those data. But what I imagine if I redid these lines, if I did basically, do that. If I did, just rewind, remember how great this was, guys? Okay, let's go back. So if I did basically this figure for income, I would imagine, I can't guess the magnitudes off the top of my head, but we would see sort of rising school segregation. The blue line would still be going up. We would basically, if we looked at income segregation among all people, we would see sort of a flat orange line. And then we would also see the green line going up. So we haven't looked super closely at like the magnitude of the difference. We were starting with race for now, but it's another thing on the list. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, any final questions?
Just leave that there. Yeah.
I'm curious about who has the economic and social power to sort of drive school segregation, and it sounds like that's what you're talking about with the white avoidance story. Are there other groups driving that?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the point here as well. I mean, groups have different preferences. Groups also have different abilities to express those preferences or to afford necessary transportation or even be able to afford to live in the neighborhood where they would want their kid to go to school. So economic power comes into play there as well. But then also, I think if we zoom out, who has the power to determine the choice set that everyone's dealing with? That's where things like housing policy, zoning policy, like that's determining what's getting built where and how much it's costing. And then similarly with education policy, right now we're in this like voucher moment where, there's craziness happening. And so the policymakers that have the power to set the choice set is also a big part of the story. And then people have differential power to choose between those choices. So yeah, great question.
Oh, one final question.
I just wondered, I'm thinking about like the Chicagoland area and like Oak Park, Evanston, some of these areas that really pushed up against some of the redlining efforts. I wondered if I don't know, there's been any research around thinking about like how might these like case studies that look a little different, or if there's anything you can do around that?
Yeah, we've started to look at like where are the places that see the biggest divergence and the biggest changes. I mean, both of those are places like Oak Park has a residential kind of mobility program to help to try to promote neighborhood integration. Evanston has a long history of like school integration programs. And so we have not done case studies yet, but they might be helpful in helping us to try to suss out some of these patterns. But yeah, we haven't even I think a next step is to start looking at things like a question earlier around like, are the differences bigger in places that are bigger or more diverse or in the South or in the North? And so we just haven't gotten into that yet. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks everybody.
Very good reminder for the sociology perspective students, we're meeting across the hall 4355 for a laser fast session about CCPR and its resources. So I hope you'll join us, and thank you everyone. And thanks, Sam.
Thanks.
Thank you.